We have Dr. Hanan Hashem. She's a researcher and community educator at the Family and Youth Institute, the FYI. Make sure you follow them online. Great resources for the entire community. Her current research focuses on contextual factors that influence American Muslim youth development, including the role of their racial, religious, and gender identities in their everyday experiences. Dr. Hanan is also a community organizer and has focused her efforts on youth empowerment. We also have Ustada Hosai Mojaddidi, and being someone who is always online for Muslim Women's Alliance, I have to say that one of the first things I do is always check if Ustada Hosai has posted. My friends and I pretty much race to share her posts every time they come out, and I can't tell you enough how much her voice is needed and the work that she does. It really speaks to where we are as women, as mothers, as daughters, as sisters, and as an ummah in this community, in this society. She is a co-founder of Mental Health for Muslims.com, a site dedicated to providing mental health-related content tailored for the Muslim community. She has served the American Muslim community for over 20 years, mashallah, and she's a spiritual advisor, public speaker, mental health advocate, interfaith organizer, mediator, and writer and editor. And I will now turn it over to our speakers, and thank you all for coming out. Thank you for supporting Muslim Women's Alliance. We will be displaying different ways that you can stay connected with us. As you can see, we are recording for YouTube channels, so if you missed any of our sessions, or if you're looking to just, if there was anything you wanted to catch up on, we'll direct you on how to watch those videos. Jazakallah khair.
All right, I'm very excited to talk about today's topic, imposter syndrome, mostly also because I have decided for myself that 2024, I'm bringing Muhammad Ali energy. I am the greatest, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is greater. So, very much related to this topic of imposter syndrome. I do have a PhD in counseling psychology, and so I spent a lot of my years in graduate school, which is not a very fun place to build your self-confidence. If anybody here is in graduate school, you would know, yes, it's a pretty tough place. So what I'm gonna do today, inshallah, is I'm gonna take a little bit of a strengths approach. We're gonna talk, instead of imposter syndrome, we're gonna flip it on its head. We're gonna talk about this concept called self-efficacy. Has anybody heard of self-efficacy before? Okay, well, you're gonna learn today, inshallah. We're all gonna learn. So self-efficacy is your own internal belief in your ability to succeed. Right? So imposter syndrome is you believe that you are not good at something, that you are an imposter, that there's something about you that actually doesn't fit the place. So instead what we're going to ask the question is, how do we build our self-efficacy? Now, people with high self-efficacy, they tend to do several things. The first thing is they are more likely to make clear, complex decisions about the things in their life. They are more likely to invest more effort in their pursuits. They are more likely to persevere for longer in face of difficulty, and they're also, and this is important, better able to manage realistic expectations of themselves. Now, when it comes to imposter syndrome and self-efficacy, there's a lot of different domains in our lives where you might feel like you're not good enough. There's our personal life, right? So maybe it's our relationship with our family. I've worked with many moms, for example, who just believe that they're just not good moms and that they're like just gonna ruin their kids. I've also worked with spouses, people who think that they're just not a good partner, or they're not a good enough daughter, or they're not a good enough X, Y, and Z in their personal life. I've also worked with people who feel like they're just not good at getting fit, exercising, eating better, taking care of themselves, so more of the personal things. But then of course we have imposter syndrome in our professional spaces as well. So I don't feel like I fit, whether it's in graduate school, or I'm an engineer, or I work for a consulting firm, or whatever it is professionally that you do. It's likely, or it's possible to have an imposter syndrome or feel like you have low self-efficacy in any of these areas. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to share with you 4 strategies to increase self-efficacy. And so I do suggest, if I see some of you have your notes open, do write notes about this, and I want you to really think about how these things apply in your life personally, but also in the domain that you're thinking about, whether it's the personal, the interpersonal, or the professional. And then I have a little funny story at the end, so bear with me, inshallah. So the first strategy to increase self-efficacy is mastery experiences. So the first question I want you to ask yourself is, how would you know that you're doing well in whatever it is that you're trying to do better at? How do you know? So as a therapist, so I'm a psychologist by training, one of the first questions I ask my clients is, how are we gonna know if you're done with therapy? Like, what's gonna change in your life? What's gonna be happening in your life so that we know that we're done, that we're good? You can stop going to therapy now, right? The point of therapy is to stop going to therapy. And so I want you to ask your question. The question for you is, how do you know when you are good enough at something? Is it when you pass your classes and the classes that you're doing? Is it when you go to the gym 3 times a week? Is it when you are able to control your anger with your child? How would you know concretely? And I'd really encourage you to think about specific behaviors that will, if once you check mark it, you're like, okay, I've been able to master this thing. And so then you take that task, the way that you know that you've done better, and you work towards that. What's really important here, inshallah, is that you identify it for yourself, but you also use your village, the people around you, to help you identify it as well. So the first is mastery experiences. So how would you know that you're doing well? You have your line item, and then you start working towards that. The second is social modeling. So one of the things that I see that really impact imposter syndrome, self-efficacy, is that we don't have people around us who look like us, right? If you wear a hijabi, if you are black, someone who's black, if you're a woman, someone who's a woman, who is doing the thing that we want to do well. Because we are a growing community, we are a minority community, we usually don't have models that we can look up to and say that's what I want to be doing. I'll tell you, for myself, I can, alhamdulillah, I feel, for myself, enough psychologists, mental health professionals in our community that I can look to and say, that's what I want to do. How do I work myself towards that? But what about if we go back to motherhood, right? How often do we have spaces where people actually talk about the realistic struggles of motherhood? How often do we have spaces where people talk about actually how difficult it is to wear a hijab in a non-Muslim setting? One of the research projects that I've done is on this idea of solo status, being the only hijabi, being the only Muslim hijabi in different spaces. And what I've found is that for folks who are the only hijabi in certain spaces, the experiences of discrimination, we actually become way more attuned to experiences of discrimination and marginalization from the people around us. And so just being the only person in different spaces can have that effect on you. And so then the question becomes, how do you counter that? So how many people here are on social media? All right. So one of the things that I actually really like about social media, and I know that there's a lot of controversy, you can have a whole debate about it, is that you can actually find somebody doing the thing that you want to be doing who looks like you on social media, which I think is actually a really incredible thing. And so putting yourself in situations or putting yourself or surrounding yourself with people, whether it's on social media, whether it's people in your community, if you're, for example, working to be an engineer, so if you're working, for example, to be an engineer, I guarantee you that there are Muslim women or Muslims who are engineers doing the things that you want to do in your space. And if it's not exactly the same thing, you want to think at least 1 degree or 2 degrees away from that. So when it comes to social modeling, though, one of the things that I want you to also think about, and this is something that actually really helps with self-efficacy and imposter syndrome, is that while you're looking for models, while you're looking for social modeling, I want you to also start thinking about yourself as a social model for the next generation and for the generation that you're in. We have to start building that social model community for our community. As we're thinking about what is it that I want to do, you want to be thinking, how do I also create space for people who want to do what I want to do, so that there is a sense of connection and a sense of a village that we have with ourselves. So the first one was mastery experiences. How do you know? How do you know that you're going to be doing good enough? What are you actually aiming for? Are you aiming for people's praise, people to praise you? Are you aiming for, a positive feedback? Are you aiming for, compliments? Are you aiming for more people to just look at you, more likes on whatever it is, right? And as a non-judgmental therapist, I want you to really go ahead and think critically about what is actually really important to you as it relates to the thing that you're feeling an imposter syndrome about. So master experiences. The second is social modeling. Finding people and being the person who can model for others and model for yourself what you're aiming for, right? That thing that you said that you were looking forward to do. The third is social persuasion. So this is where, you know how sometimes we live, sometimes you hear the, I hear sometimes don't care what other people are thinking about, right? It's all about you. One of the things about the realities of living in a community, right? One of the realities of building your own village is that you do want to surround yourself with people whose opinions you trust. And so when it comes to this thing that you're working on in regards to your imposter syndrome, you want to pick 2 or 3 people in your life, whether those are personal, family, and friends, or these are people at your workspace that you actually really trust their judgment. You see that they actually do really good work, right? You have a couple of friends that are also moms, and you're like, I really like the way that she takes care of her kids. I really like the way that she handles her in-laws. I really like the way that, she memorizes the Quran. Whatever it is, pick 2 or 3 people that can actually hold you accountable and that you can get constructive feedback from, right? We're not isolated people. We work with one another. We need one another in order to thrive. And so for social persuasion, we need to hear from other people, this is what you're doing well, and this is what you maybe could be working on. But what's important here is that you pick 2 or 3 people whose opinion that you trust. And people that you can evaluate and say, I actually really like what they're doing, right? These are not necessarily people who are modeling for you, but people who are also working with you that you can actually, you can build together. And then the fourth piece is psychological responses. So I'm giving a couple of lectures later, one later today and one tomorrow. One of the things that I really like to talk about is attachment theory. How many people have heard of attachment theory? Okay, yeah, anxious attachment, avoidant attachment, disorganized. One of the reasons I love talking about attachment theory, and I'll talk more about it tomorrow in my lecture, inshallah, is because you get to learn a lot about the natural way that you respond to stress, that you respond to criticism, to feedback from other people. So there's a couple of things the reality of each of us as individuals is that there's certain ingredients that make us who we are, right? One of those is attachment theory, or attachment styles. The other one is something called temperament, which is related to our personality, right? How many parents do we have in the room? Okay. How many parents of more than one child? Okay. So for those of you who are parents of more than one child, you will know that those 2 children that you have are different. That you can do the same exact thing, respond in the same exact way to both of those children, and they are just different. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just created them different, right? And that's related to maybe their temperament, to their attachment, to, the time, what happened when they were in utero, what their birth looked like, who their friends are, what order they are in the siblings. All of these things affect who we are and how we respond to the world around us. And so this fourth piece of imposter syndrome has to do with knowing who you are, knowing how you respond to the world around you. So for example, maybe you're somebody who needs that tough love and needs someone to be like, excuse me, this is wrong, you shouldn't be doing this. And then maybe some of you are like, no, I need very compassionate advice from somebody who's gonna couch it in compliments, but then also put it in there, like what is something that I need to work on, right? All of these different styles of feedback are acceptable, but what you need to know for yourself is what works for you. So I want you to think about the people in your life. Think about the times in your life where you've really learned from somebody around you and how they gave you feedback. And think, what was it about the way that they gave me feedback that actually made me feel good? And how can I then ask the people around me to respond to me in that way? So knowing who you are and your actual responses. So when somebody gives you, say the imposter syndrome that you're experiencing is around work, right? You feel like you are at You're at work, let's say, I'm trying to think of like different professions that are not psychology. Can I have an example? Nursing. Okay, you're at the hospital, right? You're working with a patient and you do something and then you like notice later that you like messed up, right? And so now perhaps what's happening to you is that you're feeling incredibly anxious, but on top of that anxiety, you're feeling like I am about to get into a lot of trouble. Even though you know that your boss is actually a really nice person, but your psychological and physiological response is something bad is about to happen to me. By the way, that's a trauma response. Come to my next lecture about trauma, Angela. We'll talk more about that. And so that way you know, okay, these are my psychological responses, this is my physiological response. What's happening to me internally versus what's happening outside of me. So really being able to break down your experiences around this imposter syndrome, around and building your self-efficacy can really help you understand who you are and walk in the spaces with confidence and also be able to say, you know what, I did make a mistake and I know how I'm gonna fix it. And that I am human, and that I will make mistakes, and that I will continue fixing those mistakes and get better, inshallah. And so there becomes then a sense of a reality that sinks, right? You start to manage your expectations, that I am not perfect, that I will mess up with a patient, that I might say something that's wrong, I might give somebody the wrong advice, I might get angry with my child. But then how do you repair those experiences? How do you come back from it? And all of these things, mastery experiences, social modeling, social persuasion, and psychological responses all help in that direction. Now, here's a little funny story for you. So this is one of the things that I teach in my classes, is self-efficacy to my students who are, they're psychologists in training, right? So I tell them, these are the things that you can work on with your patients. So I had one person, one woman raise her hand. She's a woman of color. Most of my students are white women, but I have a couple of women of color in the class. She raises her hand and she's like, Dr. Hashem, I'm on Reddit a lot, and on Reddit, it seems that there are a lot of men who think that they can fly planes. She's like, they just think that if they like go in front of a plane that they'll be able to fly it. And she's like, is that self-efficacy or is that something else? Right? And this is what I told her. And I'm careful to share this, but I also really want y'all to understand the difference in experiences that you have compared to folks in majority groups. How many people here have heard about the confidence of a mediocre white man? All right. Now, I see one person holding two hands up. So now, those 4 things that I listed for you, let's walk through it, but in the eyes and the experiences of a white man in this country. Mastery experiences. White men oftentimes are given positions, given promotions, given opportunities to be able to identify what are the things that they're good at, right? So it comes easier for them to be able to identify that. Social modeling. White men have many models in American society that help them identify, oh, I want to be that type of engineer, I want to be that type of nurse, I want to be that type of parent, I want to be that type of president, whatever it is, right? Social persuasion. Women are more likely to be, and this is all research-based, women are more likely to be criticized and more likely to be held to a double standard, right? Where whatever you're doing something wrong. SubhanAllah. And so in terms of social persuasion, men are more likely to experience compliments and experience praise, thank you. Right, exactly, experience praise. And then for psychological responses, now psychological responses is a little bit different, right? Because men are not expected to be emotionally in tune with themselves, but they have a different kind of emotional experience given the way that they're expected to do certain things. And so it then becomes our responsibility to identify these things for ourselves, because we recognize that American society is not going to do it for us, or if you're Canadian, Canadian society, American society, that they're not going to give us these mastery experiences, these models, these social persuasions. We have to create that for ourselves. And so then I encourage you all to do that for one another, right? Be kind and compassionate and there for one another. Be there in those support spaces. Be able to model for the next generation, but also modeling what self-efficacy looks like. What does it mean to have high self-efficacy in whatever it is that you do? SubhanAllah. So those are all of my points for today. And I appreciate your attention, and I look forward to your questions afterward, inshallah.
Jazakumullah khairan, Dr. Hanan. That was very insightful, mashallah. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala ashraf al-anbiya'i wal mursaleen. Sayyidina wa maulana wa habibina Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam tasliman kathira. So thank you all for being here. Thank you again to the Muslim Women's Alliance and Khadija and Noor and the team for inviting us to be with all of you today. This is my last talk for this program, so bittersweet, but really grateful for all of you to come out here. I know it's a long walk. We counted our steps yesterday. I think we were close to 20,000 just going through this whole facility, so mashallah. Alhamdulillah. So I'm going to reverse the gears a bit and focus more on the spiritual root causes of imposter syndrome and how to turn to our faith and, of course, the excellent role models of our tradition, many of whom, all of whom I would say, against odds and challenges that we can't even fathom, were able to accomplish really extraordinary things. So let's get into it. Bismillah. First, among the over 200, and some would say even 300, beautiful names and titles of the Prophet ﷺ is Al-Bashir wa Al-Nadhir. The Prophet ﷺ came as a bearer of glad tidings as well as a warner. He was commanded to guide us with the truth, no matter how inconvenient it was. He warned us, for example, about the signs of the latter days, which we are in. In a hadith reported in Sahih of Imam at-Tirmidhi, according to Ali ibn Abi Talib radiallahu anh, the Prophet ﷺ warned that tribulations would befall humanity if the following signs occurred. When any gain is shared out only among the rich with no benefit to the poor, when a trust becomes a means of making a profit, when paying zakat becomes a burden, when a man obeys his wife and disobeys his mother and treats his friend kindly while shunning his father, when voices are raised in the mosques, when the leader of a people is the worst of them, when people treat a man with respect because they fear some evil he may do, when much wine is drunk, when men wear silk, when female singers and musical instruments become popular, when the last ones of this ummah begin to curse the first ones, then let them expect a red wind or the earth to swallow them or to be transformed. Now, that is to say, we are again in very, very difficult and dark times. And so now we have to look to ourselves of how do we address this evil that we see. There are many challenges, of course. Among the many evils that we have to contend with as Muslims living today is that there is a deliberate attempt, this inversion of good and evil, truth and falsehood, and virtue and vice. And that can certainly destabilize our own sense of identity. If we're dealing with all of these challenges, witnessing all of these injustices and atrocities, then we may find ourselves riddled with self-doubt. And this is where our deen, alhamdulillah, gives us guidance on how to fortify ourselves, to know who we are, to have a strong sense of purpose and identity. So we have to go back to our faith. And this is why it's so important to, again, humanize ourselves, because all of us, as Dr. Hanan mentioned, we've had to deal with these feelings of just inadequacy, of uncertainty within ourselves. But we have to be realistic and say it's because of the byproduct of the challenging times that we live in, the conflicting messages that we get between culture, within society, and sometimes even from amongst our religious leaders. It's like, it's very bewildering and disorienting to have multiple messages, and that can certainly, as I said, destabilize one's identity. So one of my favorite concepts that comes from Imam al-Ghazali, which I think is something we have to revive and teach. And as a teacher of teenagers and high school students especially, or adolescents I should say, even college students and beyond, where identity is shaped, that is the age of identity formation, I think a tool like what Imam al-Ghazali gave us is so important to understand, especially to combat these types of ideas that plague the mind, that keep people awake at night, constantly, again, conflicted internally. So what he gave us was this concept that we are actually three parts. It's called the tri-part or triune human being. And I wish I had my slideshow. I normally have slides because I'm a visual learner and I like to, and I'm a teacher, so I use those tools and mediums. But I'll try to be as descriptive as possible. But this the tri-part human, what does he describe? So, well, first he says that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave the human being faculties, abilities, capabilities. The first faculty is the quwwat al-aqliya, which is the rational faculty. This is the mind. And he uses the analogy of the human being or a person. And he says that the rational mind is what differentiates the human being from all of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's creation. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave us or he aligned our body in this form where the mind, the head, the crown is at the top of our creation, because it is the most significant and important part of what he created us with. We are, of course, commanded, the first commandment was to read, and so to engage on a rational, intellectual level is why we are different from, again, all of his creation. So that's the first faculty. The second faculty he describes is what he calls quwwat al-ghadabiyya. And this is centered in the heart. And quwwat al-ghadabiyya refers to emotions. And he uses a really interesting analogy, and he says that the best analogy to understand this part of the human being is a hunting dog. Because a hunting dog has to be trained, right? If you're a hunter, I don't know if this would apply here. Anybody go hunting here? If you're a hunter, if you've ever hunted before, you have to train the animal to retrieve your hunt for you, you know? So if you have a dog or even a bird, I know in some countries they use birds of prey to retrieve the hunt. So you have to put some time in there, but he uses the dog, and he says that that's how emotions have to be trained. You have to learn how to use emotions in the right context, in the right time, in the right place. So that's the second part of the human being. And then he says the third part is the quwwat al-shahwaniyya, which is the appetitive part of the human being. And he roots those in the stomach and the private parts. And so he says that the likening or the analogy for that part of the human being is the pig. Because the pig, if it's not, if it doesn't have boundaries or parameters, it will overconsume, and that's what happens when human beings don't have something, again, to hold or to work within. Those boundaries are very important. And so we have, of course, Sharia, generally, the Islamic Sharia provides those boundaries, but also just in general, boundaries are good for human beings. So when you don't have those boundaries and you don't have, then what happens is you begin to behave the way that a pig does, which is, insatiable appetite. You do only what serves your appetites without any consideration for the impact of your actions. And so why is this significant? Because again, when you look at the situation or the condition that many of us find ourselves today, we live in a society that wants us, and some would say maybe even cultures and family systems and communities that focus us more towards our emotional appetites or our quwwat al-ghadabiyya and our appetites than our intellectual capacities. And so when we're focused on feelings a lot and appetites a lot, and we're trying to fill ourselves, we're going to not come into what our best potential. And our best potential is reached when we really start to formulate our understanding of who we are. And that's why it's so important, again, to go back to the mind and to really think things through. So as I mentioned, when you look at the companions of the Prophet ﷺ, you have to marvel. He had, some say, over 60,000 companions. Many of them, they were, they came from humble beginnings. They weren't the most educated, the way that we would, frame that in today's modern context. Some were unlettered. But how were they able to do such extraordinary things? Because the Prophet ﷺ, among his many virtues, was that he always saw the potential in people, and he wanted people to realize their own abilities by doing what? By helping them to come into a clear understanding of who they are. That the most important aspect of you is your alignment with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you see yourself as a creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that was brought into existence with intention, and you really start to develop that concept a little bit. Like, think about that for a moment. Like, we could have not existed. We could have not been brought into existence, right? But he wanted us here for a reason. And then you start to really tap into that, to pursue that line, like, what is that reason? Why am I here? And when you do that within the parameters of your faith, and you're really looking at everything that our faith teaches you, you will find that it will help you to prevent falling into the traps of things like imposter syndrome, which are all really, if we want to deconstruct it from a spiritual position, it's waswasa, right? Iblis has access to us, right, through our mind and heart, but if we can follow the stream of consciousness that plagues us, if we can pay attention to the types of thoughts that we have, and we can start to really see what are they based on, where are they coming from, what is the source of why do I feel this way, then you will find oftentimes that it's he who has, what does he do? He whispers, right? These are subtle hints. And so these negative ideas that we get, this chatter that preoccupies a lot of people, which then prevents people from really meeting their own potential, is all part of the khutuwat of shaitan. This is how he operates. So how to combat that is, again, from an intellectual perspective, to go back and understand that you are significant, that we are significant by virtue of our existence, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us means and abilities that we have to develop. We have to take that into our own hands and really work on developing. And what we find, though, in this day and age, because we all know the hadith, oftentimes, especially, I look back to my youthful age where I was in my college years, I would say I was definitely an activist, and I had a lot of desire to change the world. I wanted to change everybody, but because I didn't have the spiritual context that the best way to change the world is to work on changing yourself. So I externalized all of that angst, all of that emotion, because I was operating from what? The Qut al-Ghadabiyya. I had my own issues, and if you really think about the spirit of our time, right, that we see, the zeitgeist, this is what we have. We're living in a period where people are in their feelings so much that they're acting from that place of feelings. But if we don't have the guidance of the mind that's controlling and able to temper those feelings, then you find people all over the place, scattered about. So our deen is certainly a deen of social justice, it's certainly a deen of activism, it's certainly a deen of action, it's certainly a deen of speaking up. The Prophet ﷺ, we all know the hadith, whoever among you sees you evil, let him change it with his hand. If he cannot do so, then with his tongue. If he cannot do so, then with his heart, which is the weakest of faith. We know this hadith and we want to spring into action, but then we forget that the first imperative, the first thing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from us before we suddenly start policing everyone else and everything else, is to look back within ourselves and to root out any insincerity or spiritual diseases. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَتَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْبِرِّ وَتَنْسَوْنَ أَنفُسَكُمْ وَأَنْتُمْ تَتْلُونَ الْكِتَابَ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. These are rhetorical questions. They're questions that are very deep. He says, do you enjoin righteousness upon people while you forget yourselves, even though you recite the scripture? Do you not understand? And he also says, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِمْ. Indeed, Allah does not change the condition of a people until they change what is within themselves. So the real way to combat these ideas that stifle people, that prevent people from reaching their own potential, that keep our voices suppressed when we should be vocal, is to actually come into an understanding that you have to develop yourself first. You have to give time to yourself. For those of you who were in attendance yesterday on the topic of the Sunnah of Love, I introduced a topic that I speak about often, which is emotional intelligence. And emotional intelligence is a wonderful modern framework, but it's certainly not anything revelatory in today's context, because it's all, anyways, I explained yesterday, but it's all rooted in our deen. The first point of emotional intelligence, if anyone was there, do you know what it was? Anybody? I'll put Khadija on the spot. No, I'm just kidding. The organizers. No, the first quality of emotional intelligence is self-awareness. So you cannot, and what is emotional intelligence? It's managing your own emotions and other people. It's basically what we're talking about. You want to change everything. You want to just be a vehicle of change, a voice of change. Well, how do you even start to do that? It's self-awareness. You have to know who you are. You have to know your temperament, as Dr. Hanan mentioned, and all of these other aspects of the way that we operate as human beings and what the influences of our decisions are, how we're affected by energy, by people, by the things that we consume, right? Social media, again, the debate, there is a debate because social media can be productive and it can be quite destructive. But if you haven't worked yourself out, then you're susceptible to these problems. But once once you start to put an inward focus on yourself and really see that you were created, it's an incredible, I mean, to be a human being is an incredible gift. It really is. If you think about it, we were just talking about animals, and I was saying, I wish I could talk to my cat, because we have a cat. And I'm like, sometimes I wish I could communicate with my cat. And then you think about language, and you think about the fact that I can just make these utterances, and you guys understand what I'm saying based on just sounds coming out of my mouth. These are extraordinary things that come from the existence, from being a human being. But there's much more to the puzzle that we have to work out. And if we spend some time in understanding ourselves, really paying attention to the nuances, because we're all just like the fingerprints that we have on our fingers and the DNA that's within our cells. We are unique on a very individual level, and certainly the way that we work, the skills that we have, the gifts that we have, and also our shortcomings. Those are also aspects of who we are. And this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala expects from us, that we spend our time engaged with trying to really be the best versions of ourselves. And if we do that, then we can again protect ourselves from what so many other people, and as someone, again, Dr. Hanan would know, being in the mental health field, but the suffering that we see in our community, from the young to the old, everybody. I mean, I spent today an hour and a half with a sister, may Allah bless her, who's a very educated, very confident sister in many respects, but she's also riddled with a lot of self-doubt. And I can tell you many cases that the self-doubt is plaguing us, and it's preventing us because we are very focused on things that are not going to maybe give us the results that we're looking for, and we're neglecting the very thing that will actually affect change, which is the heart, which is our own selves. So that, again, the moral imperative of every one of us, before we start to look outwardly and change everyone else, is to look within ourselves. And just to end here, the examples that we have in our tradition, as I mentioned before, I mean, these people, just one example that comes to mind, for example, Sayyidah Khadija, she is an exemplar for us women anyhow, and there's many examples, of course, from the Sahaba and the righteous people, but just to take her as an example, at 18 years old, you could just imagine an 18-year-old, she is a scholar, she is a jurist, she is a faqihah, she's relating the second from the women, she relates the most hadith, but she is a scholar of Islam. Men with beards who are much older than her, maybe 5, 10 decades more on her in terms of years and experience in life, are coming to learn from her. How does that happen? It's because something was tapped into. Right? She was obviously the wife of the beloved sallallahu alaihi wasallam, so she had access to the perfect human being, and she learned and she observed and she witnessed and she paid attention. But she also came into her own, and that's why she has a legacy of her own after his passing. So this is what Islam can do, and many people, modern examples too. We can look at Malcolm X and many of our wonderful exemplars in our age, and look at how Islam transformed them. But what did they tap into? It was obviously Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who guided them, but they saw themselves in the light that we're supposed to see ourselves, which is the potentiality that we all have to reach even higher than the angels. And we can't do that if we're outwardly focused. So inward focus, spiritual focus, taskiyat an-nafs, working on purifying the spiritual heart, working on acquiring prophetic character, being really rooted in our deen, is how we will create those protections that are so necessary in today's world to combat what so many people are suffering through, not just with imposter syndrome, but a lot of different problems that we have that are, the way that I see it, they're infiltrating, they're coming through because the gate is wide open. So we have to close those gates. We have to close and protect our spiritual heart. It's the greatest thing that we have to present to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We have to protect it. So that's what Islam is. It's a shield, it's a protection, it's a force. But we've forgotten our way, we've lost our way. So may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us all. Jazakumullahu khairan. There's more to say, but inshallah, I think we have some time for Q&A maybe? Maybe? Just a couple questions?
Just because there's people that need to pray us.
Oh, sure. Got it. All right. Jazakumullahu khairan. Inshallah. Barakallahu fikum.